He stepped over the sodden rushes as King Rognvold pressed the blade into his palm and the thrall Bjorn screamed. Suspicion tightened his fingers around the lantern. The metal edge bit his palm through leather as he held steady. The assembled clans fell silent when blood touched the shallow bowl. Someone spat, someone wept, someone spat again. The investigator moved closer, watching the crown bearer's hand tremble as shield maiden Sigrun reached forward and was shoved back by a man with a carved spear. He had come to record a coronation reconstruction, not witness a live rite, but the living tableau had been staged with such precise cruelty that the air felt like evidence. The investigator touched the rune, inscribed journal at his belt. He adjusted his spectacles, smelled iron and smoke, and mapped the scene across his mind. The king, the blade, the kneeling clans, the thrall forced forward by two older men. His suspicion did not sit as an idea. It became a measuring tool that guided every step he took toward documents and witnesses. "Stop, Sigrun." "Rognvold, you will not, shield maiden Sigrun," Rognvold answered, voice flat. "Either you swear with us or you stand aside." Sigrun lowered her head. The investigator watched her jaw set, saw the way her fingers curled around the haft of a short axe. That small visible decision, hold or act, was the kind of proof he sought. Choice under pressure. He wrote 3 marks in his journal while the crowd chanted an oath phrase he did not yet recognize. The chant made a steady rhythm. It made the bowl of blood catch and flicker in candlelight. Within 5 minutes the ritual tableau ended, and the crowd broke. The investigator followed the thrall's unsteady steps down the hill and recorded a list of names chiseled into a carved ledger left at the foot of the mound. The ledger was damp with mud and faint dark streaks. He photographed rune sequences, traced the cracked runes with his fingertip, and felt curiosity rise from mere suspicion into something fiercer. He needed to know whether the rite was theta or an instrument of rule. An hour later, in the longhouse storeroom, where torches threw hard shadows, Elder Torvald waited beside a half-buried runestone. He was a broad man with a lined face. His hands moved intentionally as he turned the stone to show a streak of dark stain. The investigator bent close. "This runestone found itself under a midden 3 years back, Torvald. We dug it free. The marks were already there." The investigator tapped at the stained groove. "Torvald, did you ever see a rune used like this in a ceremony?" Torvald shrugged. "We used runes in names. We used runes against wolves. But this, Rognvold has had this carved before he took the throne," a farmer said from the doorway. "He paid hands and grain." The investigator recorded the farmer's words. He watched Torvald's eyes narrow when the investigator about dates. That narrowing was a small shift from polite recollection to guarded memory. It pulled the investigator from curiosity again toward caution. He could feel a pattern forming, coercion where others called custom. Night fell, and the investigator carried the runestone rubbing back to his lantern-lit study. On the table a skald named Hakon unfolded a torn scrap of parchment and laid it between 2 weights. Hakon's fingers trembled as he smoothed the vellum. "Read it," the investigator. Hakon breathed out. "It names clauses. It names the calling phrase used against dissenters." "Read the phrase," the investigator. Hakon read, voice low. "By blade and blood, by oath and doom, may those who break the word feel the storm." The investigator repeated the last 2 words to himself. "Storm," he said. "Do they mean weather or a sign?" Hakon tapped the parchment. "It says, 'Signs will be made to appear. A thing falls, a well runs dry. A mark finds the house of the rebel. The people see the sign. They obey or they die.'" The investigator felt fear shift through him then, no idle dread, but concrete concern about credibility. If a ritual promised visible consequences and those consequences appeared, obedience would be bought cheaply. He wrote the phrase down. He Hakon where the parchment had come from. The skald who sang at the hilltop kept it. He traded one night's med for another man's memory, Hakon. He says he saw a thing at the sacrifice. He says the wind changed. "Who is this skald?" "The investigator." "Hakon," the skald said. "You of me." The investigator and Hakon argued for the chronology. Hakon insisted the omen had come immediately after the thrall's death. The investigator wanted names of witnesses, he pressed. Hakon named Sigrun and 2 clan elders who knelt, Eric and Molla. That list gave him new leads and a clearer map of human actors behind the ritual. 3 nights later, when the investigator followed a lead into a longhouse courtyard to watch a reconstructed coercion, Shield Maiden Sigrun stepped between a family and the king. She grabbed her father's wrist as Rognvald demanded a portion of blood be cut. "Rognvald!" Sigrun, step aside, Sigrun, Rognvald. "Bjorn is bleeding," Sigrun answered. "You cut enough." Rognvald laughed, and the man who held the blade shoved Sigrun hard. She stumbled, spat dirt, and stood. The father, bent hollow-eyed, trembled where he knelt. The investigator leaned forward to note the father's hands and how they refused to meet Sigrun's eyes. He wrote, "Coercion, public humiliation, enforced blood." Sigrun spoke then, but not to Rognvald. "Bjorn," she said, voice low, "tell me where your mother hides the bread." Bjorn looked up. "I do not know." Sigrun pressed a finger along the thrall's jaw. Her tone changed. It was not the voice she used in battle. "Bjorn," she said, "you do not answer me and you will die. Tell me." The father cried out. The crowd shifted. The investigator saw the exact moment the father's loyalty broke. He recorded the sound in a margin. A wet, sudden keening that ended when the father spat and knelt lower. That sound would later connect the ledger's carved names to people who no longer spoke freely. On a wet morning in a ruined temple chamber, the investigator met Cirith Fraser. She kept a small heap of bone fragments and a string of amber. Her eyes moved over the rune, sequence the investigator had copied from the runestone rubbing. "You read runes, Fraser." "I read sequences," the investigator corrected. "What does this clause say?" Fraser traced the pattern. "It ties the oath to a consequence, not metaphor. A clause names the punishment, loss of herd, sickness in the house, or the sign at birth. The clause names targets by kin name. Targets by kin name. The investigator. "Yes. If you swear with me, your house is safe. If you break the word, your kin is marked and the storm comes." The investigator felt a new shift from suspicion and curiosity into alarm. He imagined an oath that already contained the procedure to single out families and make a calamity follow, a legal technology of fear. He wrote the kin, names from the rubbing, and compared them to a ledger of buried bones at the valley edge. He dug with local farmer Ingrid beside a shallow burial trench. Fingers numb, back aching, Ingrid held a rusted knife while he cleared a wooden tag with carved letters. Inside lay small bones, packed tight, each with a token beside it. A braided strand, a young child's bead, a worn wooden comb. Ingrid wiped soil from the ledger board beside the trench and read names aloud. "Ingrid, the investigator, what is this list?" Ingrid's voice was hard. "They are the losses. You will find mothers, sons." She pointed to a name and spat. This one took a blade at the hilltop. He wrote the names into his ledger and compared dates. The pattern was not accidental. The bright, specific tokens at each grave tied a ritual list to living families. That connection made the oath operational. It produced victims and recorded them as evidence of obedience. When he returned to the village assembly hall to ask for permission to consult older records, Council Elder Segrid met him at the threshold. Her hands were clean and steady. Her words were a polite block. "You have a choice, investigator, Sigrid. We will not have old wounds pried open." "Sigrid, the ledger names people," he replied. "You will not publish things that unsettle the order," she said. "Order is what keeps our winter stores intact." They argued with quick bursts of lines. The investigator pressed Sigrid on a single ledger entry. Sigrid's expression tightened. She stepped back and said, "Ask Torvald." Outside the hall he met Torvald again. Torvald's voice had a carefully placed irritation. "The oath keeps raiders away, Torvald. It binds men who would otherwise fight." "You mean it frightens them into staying," the investigator answered. Torvald looked at the investigator's journal and then at the stone field. "Words have weight," he said. That exchange shifted the investigator's approach from proof gathering to strategy. He realized now that he could not only document, he needed to show how the ritual made threats credible. He planned an experiment, a public reading of a clause and a controlled showing of a sign, so he could watch whether people altered behavior when a sign appeared. It was dangerous. It was necessary. The experiment, performed with careful allies, produced the unexpected. At dawn on a sodden hill, a staged sign, smoke from a hidden pit, a carved mark in fresh earth, appeared within minutes of the reading. A child screamed, the clans folded their hands, and one elder crossed himself. Someone in the crowd whispered, "It works." That whisper was small and precise, and it changed the tone in the investigator's notebook from academic curiosity to grim understanding. The ritual had a technology. Staged omens and controlled rumor made the oath credible. The chapter reached its peak at the hilltop sacrifice. The investigator watched as Bjorn was forced to the mound. He noted the exact sequence. The blade pressed, the bowl filled, Sigrun stepping forward, Rogvold intoning the clause, Bjorn's throat cut. The crowd gasped. Then, within minutes, a raven flew down and landed on a nearby rock, its plumage catching the weak dawn light in a way that made its feathers look wet and black around the edges. An elder cried, "The raven comes for the oath." Sigrun whispered, "This is a sign." The investigator recorded names, actions, and the elder's line in the margin. The crowd took the raven as proof. They took Bjorn's death as evidence the claws had teeth. The investigator felt a final emotional shift in himself, from alarm into a focused, cold clarity. He understood how terror had been braided into legitimacy. He spent the morning afterwards cross-referencing carved ledger entries and burial tokens. Each name in the ledger matched either threatened families or actual victims. Ingrid confirmed one name as her brother. Torvald confirmed another as a raider turned loyal after a marked loss. The evidence compounded. That afternoon, the investigator returned to his study and laid out every rubbing, ledger, and scrap. He catalogued whom the oath protected and whom it targeted. He thought of Shieldmaiden Sigrun's fingers around Bjorn's jaw, of Torvald's steady denial, of Hakon's torn parchment, of Freyja's bone pile. Each person had played a role. Sigrid knocked at his door as dusk came. He heard her voice through the wood. "You have compiled a ledger," she said. "Give it to me." "No," he answered. "Not now. You put my village at risk, Sigrid." If the oath is a tool of rule, Sigrid, hiding it only keeps the same power. There was silence. Then Sigrid, you will break more than power if you push. The investigator closed his journal and counted the carved names once more. He set the rune stone, rubbing atop the pile, and wrapped the ledger in oilcloth. Outside, someone offered the sound of a cart passing the lane. He felt the hinge of decisions, publish and provoke, or hold and protect. He chose neither immediately. Instead, he moved to the window, lifted the brass lantern, and waited. A knock came at the door then, single, measured. The investigator put his hand on the lock, felt his pulse against the leather of his satchel, and said aloud, not to the room but to himself, "Open." He turned the iron ring on the latch, unbolted the door, and found Elder Torvald standing there with mud on his boots and a wet runestone rubbing in his hand. Torvald's face was unreadable. The investigator gestured him inside. Torvald stepped in and closed the door behind him. "We have a problem, Torvald. The ledger will do more than name. It will send us to war." The investigator set down the lantern. He opened his journal to the page where he had listed Bjorn and the raven and the carved names. He slid the page toward Torvald. "Then show me where you stand," the investigator. Torvald sat and with a finger pointed to a single carved name. "That one is mine," he said. "My brother." The investigator looked at the name, at Torvald, and at the ledger. He had found the instrument of rulership. He had also found the human cost. He closed the journal and pushed it back across the table. Outside, a cart creaked again. Inside, the men spoke in low lines. The investigator's chest tightened in an old way, suspicion tempered by understanding, curiosity hardened into duty. The chapter ended not with resolution, but with a choice in motion. To expose the oath and change how people obeyed, or to bury the ledger and let the hilltop rites continue. The knock had come. The conversation would decide which world followed. A thrall screamed as a blade sliced the flesh of his palm, and dark blood pooled into a shallow wooden bowl. Suspicion drove the investigator from the longhouse shadows. He moved closer, lantern held low, eyes fixed on the wet rune beginning to bloom on the thrall's skin. The shout cut the night. "Stop this, Sigrun!" The blade's owner did not stop. The investigator dropped his weight forward and stayed where he could watch without being seen. He had seen an oath taken on a hilltop once, King Rognvold pressing steel into a man's hand while rushes sucked the blood. And he remembered how the clans fell quiet when the ritual finished. That memory sat under his ribs and sharpened every step he took now toward the coastal courtyard. He crouched at the longhouse wall and counted figures in the ring, making a quick map in his head. Hooded men, a throne of carved wood behind them, a shallow bowl catching candlelight, Jarl Sigrun's shoulder caught in a braid of muted gold. The investigator checked the lantern flame, checked the way the tide's wind pulled smoke across their faces. He kept his hands steady because suspicion had turned into duty. He would not let an oath be renewed in secret without learning precisely how. A thrall's scream became a bell. Someone spat. A child behind the ring swallowed hard. The investigator slid a finger across the coarse wooden planks and traced the hairline fracture in the bowl's rim with the tip of his lantern. His pulse measured itself as he watched a hooded hand press the blade and another press the thrall's palm open. The blade's metal flashed and then stayed, warm red on the wood. He stepped out from shadow and said, "Who binds this oath?" Silence snapped toward him. Jarl Sigrun's voice filled the space immediately, clipped and cold. "Step back. This is not for eyes that do not swear." He kept his hand on the throat strap of his cloak as if it were a mark and not just clothing. The investigator kept the lantern steady between them. "Sigrun, the investigator, why renew at midnight? Why hide?" Sigrun's jaw tightened. "We do what keeps the clan whole. You are not of the inner ring tonight." His voice had the worn cadence of someone used to command, but not to being questioned in the act. Skald Eric answered with a scoff and a lifted shoulder. "We sing it when needed, Jarl. Let the thrall learn his place." The thrall Olaf knelt with his hand open and breathing fast. His face was pale where his sleeve had been pushed back. The cut on his palm was small but bleeding. Olaf's lips trembled as he whispered, "I swore to you, Jarl. I swore to the king." His voice broke, not with metaphor, but with the literal cracking of hope inside his throat. Confrontation hardened the air. The investigator plainly, "Does the king's hand pass into this?" Eric blinked and looked away for a moment before answering. "There are words. There is certain oil. Sometimes." He hesitated, then pushed a palm flat on the rough stone of the threshold as if steadying himself. "Sometimes a token is used." His hands smelled faintly of smoked fish and ink. The investigator knelt by the bowl when the ring's attention shifted. He put the lantern close and touched the rim of the bowl with a finger, feeling the sticky dark blood cool against his nail. He bent and leaned forward to examine the thrall's palm. The rune there was crooked and shallow, carved as the blade closed, and already beginning to hold color. He traced the rune's curl with his fingertip and felt a faint raised edge under the skin, as if the mark had been etched into more than flesh. Skald Eric reached into his tunic and, when the Jarl's eyes flicked, produced a smeared scrap of parchment. He held it between finger and thumb and let the lantern light pick out old ink strokes. "You see this?" "Eric, I copied it from an old page in the hall's chest. It says how to bind a man when he will not stand of his own." A thrall convulsed at the runestone and fell forward as the carved runes on the stone darkened with fresh wetness. Suspicion tightened in the investigator's chest. He stepped out of the crowd, lantern held low, and counted the breaths between convulsion and cry. The immediate problem was visible. The oath runes still bound flesh and obedience, and the village had become the site of an active, violent proof. The investigator moved toward the stone because suspicion demanded answers, and because the thrall's scream matched the pattern he'd seen at the hilltop and in the longhouse. He crouched beside Bjorn and placed his palm near the cold bowl of water, while a woman pushed through the circle. Sigrun's hand flew to the wound on Bjorn's palm. Bjorn, Sigrun, hold on. The investigator touched Bjorn's wrist and felt the tremor move through bone. He smelled iron and smoke and old tar from the runestone's crevice. He detected the same wet rune pattern that had appeared earlier in the longhouse binding and on the hilltop oath. He had watched King Rogvold press the blade into a man's palm in Chapter 1. He had stood in the longhouse with lantern light mapping a blood bloom on soft skin in Chapter 2. Those memories were concrete. The blade's metal edge biting a thrall's howl, the shallow wooden bowl catching blood. Now the runes flaring at dusk made the pattern into a living, repeated act. The investigator's suspicion shifted into determination. He would not let another strange death be explained away as fate. People shouted. A man pulled his child backward. An elder mumbled a name and spat into the sand. The investigator, stand back, his voice was low. Eldra, the rune keeper, stayed near the hut's doorway and watched with her hands folded against the wool of her apron. She refused help with her eyes. Eldra, the investigator, tell me what these marks do. She did not answer. The crowd's posture changed from fear to accusation in a single movement. A cluster of clan members pointed at the investigator and then at Eldra. She binds them. One man said. Eldra binds them for the king. Sigrun stepped between the men and the rune. Keeper Sigrun, the investigator, stay with Bjorn. She looked at him and nodded once, jaw clenched. They carried Bjorn to the hut on a tarp. The investigator observed details because details were evidence. A thumbprint of dried blood on a lintel, rune chalk spilled in a corner. A pot of ash cooling by the hearth. He pried the lid from the ash pot and found a coarse powder of bone and peat. He tasted nothing. He took a scrap of cloth rubbed with the powder and stuffed it into his journal pouch. That night the investigator forced the hut door. He had chosen to act, and that choice inverted fear into purpose. He found Eldra by the low table, her hands moving slow as she rubbed oil into a weathered stave. She did not stand when he entered. Eldra, the investigator, show me the implements. She set the stave down without looking up. Eldra's face held lines like carved wood. When she spoke, her voice was small but direct. You come for answers, investigator. Yes, he said, show me the formula. She set a fragment of vellum on the table. Damp at the edges, not for you to take, she said. It will bring men to the hall if you show it in wrong hands. He touched the vellum and felt grit in the fibers. He unrolled it slowly and found rune marks written in a precise sequence and interlined with a recipe. Blood, ash, and hearth, peat, measured by weight and hour. Doubt slipped into the investigator's mind. The marks matched the longhouse rune that blushed on Bjorn's palm, but the paper named the dead. Son of Harik, 3 nights past. He lifted his head. Who feeds this? He asked. Eldra's mouth tightened. Orders, she said. Orders from the hall. Her fingers trembled. The investigator's doubt sharpened into anger. He stood and slapped his palm on the table. Orders from Rogvold, he demanded. Eldra flinched. She swallowed and then leaned forward. Rogvold sends men for the names. He will not risk the rule without the binding. He pays coin, he gives protection. We write what we are told. We tie the ash to the blade, we read the rune, we wash hands in the bowl. The clans follow, or they are marked. Her voice was flat, a resigned ledger. Sigrun burst into the hut, as if the doorway could hold the night back. Sigrun, the investigator, we need what else, you know? Sigrun's eyes were red. Sigrun paced and then said, they take Bjorn, they take Thomas. They will burn any record. We have to move the chronicle. The investigator's actions turned quick. He gathered the fragment, the oilcloth, and the ash pot. They moved like thieves, not heroes. He shoved the documents into his satchel and wrapped the stave in wool. Outside, a dog barked once and then fell silent. At the abandoned scriptorium, the investigator spread the wet vellum on a table by the collapsed skylight. He and Eldra worked together by oil lantern and chance daylight. He sketched the rune sequence while she identified marginal notes. See here, Eldra. Tapping a faded mark, they mixed the dead with the coronation soil. They grind bone into ash. The investigator traced the letters with a finger and felt sticky residue. They manufacture the sacred, he said, and did not let his voice show triumph. A sudden knock made them both start. Sigrun froze by the door. "Who goes?" she called. No answer. They laughed too short. A new fear moved through the investigator. Exposure. He folded the vellum into oilcloth and laid it in a hollow under the floorboard. He decided to find witnesses before the guards could take them. The night's raid came quicker than any of them expected. The royal guard moved like a black tide through the lanes. A young guard elbowed past the investigator, then grabbed Bjorn by the arm. "Royal command," one shouted. "Silence and relocation." The investigator lunged. "You cannot take him." He grabbed the man's wrist. The guard pulled back and struck the investigator across the ribs with the haft of his spear. "Stop." Sigrun screamed, "Sigrun!" The name tore across the lane. The investigator tasted blood in his mouth and thought of the blade at the hilltop. The abduction felt public and private at once. The guard dragged Bjorn toward a waiting cart. Thomas tried to follow and was shoved to the mud. The investigator risked a follow through marsh paths, boots sucking at peat, cloaks snagging on reeds. Night pressed on both sides of their small band. The investigator's determination shifted into cold calculation. He kept to shadowed ditches and held the rune map inside his satchel. Sigrun kept pace, breathing hard. "Where are you taking them?" she demanded. "To the hall." A passing Pete. "Cutter spat. The king decides." He will stop the unrest. Their pursuit ran through reeds, across a broken causeway, and ended at the Maid Hall gate where torches lined the yard. They watched from a tree line as the guards led Bjorn and two others inside. The investigator whispered, "We wait until dawn." "We cannot storm the yard." Sigrun's hand tightened on his sleeve. "We cannot let them try the oath again," she said. "We must break the bond before the hall gathers." He nodded. Dawn arrived cold. The Maid Hall packed with clans. Elders stood in a line. King Rogvold sat with his cloak and a new carved throne. The investigator took his place among the crowd and unrolled his evidence in the palm of his hand as if it were a small weapon. He felt the ledger of blood and ash tremble. He stepped forward and spoke up loud enough to reach the nearest elder. "King Rogvold, the investigator, you stand to be crowned on a lie built from ashes and stolen bodies." Voices hissed. The hall sair tightened around him with hands and murmurs. King Rogvold's face reddened. "You accuse me," he said. "Rogvold." Sigrun from the floor. "Stop this," another man called. "Burn the liar!" The investigator slashed his palm across the vellum, letting a smear of his own blood darken the edge. "Look," he said. "Repeat the binding and I will show the record." A quick exchange of glances moved like flint. Sigrun did not wait for agreement. She stepped onto the dais and drew a blade. She held the steel to her palm and cut in a clean motion. Blood beaded and dropped into a shallow bowl set down in front of the king. Sigrun's hand shook. "Sigrun," someone said. "Sigrun, what are you?" She pressed her palm to the bowl and then to a small strip of rawhide that Eldra had smeared with ash. The investigator stood at the edge of the dais and spread the vellum upon the oak as if unfurling a verdict. King Rogvold rose. "You shame the hall," he said. "Rogvold, the investigator, these rites used dead men to create obedience. You ordered the names. You took their sons." The hall-ass reaction divided like a cut. Some clansmen shouted for blood. Others stood frozen, staring at the wet marks on Sigrun's hand. Rogvold barked an order. His guards moved like a single muscle. A spear planted into the floor as a man lunged towards Sigrun. The investigator shoved himself between the spear and her body. He felt the iron's tip graze his shoulder and then a boot smash into his chest. "You trespass on the king's rights. Rognvold, take them." The guards closed. The hall erupted into fighting. Drink carts toppled. A torch struck against a carved beam and rain of sparks fell. The confrontation escalated into violence that was concise and raw. Sigrun's blade flashed across a guard's forearm. Bjorn, dragged from below, kicked a man's shins. Elders tried to calm the clans, but some joined the fray. The investigator grabbed the vellum and shouted, "Look at names!" He pointed at the rolled pages where the chronicle listed bodies and dates. "See how they were folded into the coronation." The hall split into voices that argued about sanctity and lies. During the brawl, a sudden twist revealed itself. A guard reached for the vellum and paused when he saw a marginal note in a different hand. For Rognvold's grant, 2 sealed boxes delivered. The guard hesitated, reading the name of a known quarterman. He looked up at Rognvold and then at the crowd. "Rognvold." The guard muttered. His hesitation threw a measure of confusion into the camp. A few guards lowered their spears. The investigator seized the moment and called out, "The hall keeps records of its own crimes. These are not God's markings." Their logistics, the room cracked open into a new argument. 3 guards pulled Rognvold to the dais and tried to hold him back. The king, furious, slapped a man's face and drew a knife. He lunged for the investigator. Sigrun threw herself between them and slashed her palm across the king's wrist. Blood flew, Rognvold reeled, and a ring of silence opened. Then someone shouted and the fighting resumed. In the melee, the investigator watched choices being made. Some clan elders stepped forward and put themselves between the guards and the thralls. Others backed the crown and gripped spear shafts. Bjorn, freed in the confusion, stumbled up the dais and bared his palm to the crowd. "I am not bound." The crowd fell into a tense hush, testing the miracle. Sigrun spoke into that hush. "Sigrun," she said, breathing hard, "this counter rune works if it is read in the hall, and the oath's witness is present." Her voice held a command. The investigator set the vellum before the elders and read aloud the counter sequence Eldra had taught him. His voice was steady, each rune enunciated like a number. He felt hands press into his shoulder. He did not stop. The oath stain on Bjorn's palm did not smoke or burn. It remained. For a moment nothing happened, and breath sharpened into a small intake. Then the dark line on Bjorn's skin faded, blotched with pale flesh as if someone had dabbled water across ink. Someone cried out. The royal guard staggered. Rognvold's gaze flicked from the pale line to Sigrun, and then to the gathered elders. Rognvold roared and ordered suppression. Men surged forward. An elder named Harold stepped up and asked for a formal hearing. Harold, the investigator, the chronicle must be presented before the clans. Harold stood and read the names from the vellum aloud. He looked at Rognvold and then at the gathered houses. A division formed like a crack down the hall. Some clanspeople left in a slow, angry stream. Others rallied to the king. The fighting moved from the dais to the courtyard. Rognvold, wounded in wrist and pride, retreated with 40 loyal men. Those remaining among the clans declared independence or were seized for questioning. The investigator ran through overturned benches and casks of mead, snatching up pages and hiding them beneath his cloak. He saw 2 guards set fire to a corner of the hall where other records lay. He put his shoulder against a burning beam and rolled the remaining parchments free of flame. By midday the yard bore the marks of the clash. Blood on planks, a broken carved throne, a child's shoe crushed in mud. Sigrun sat on a splintered bench, her hands shaking as she pressed them to her wrists. Bjorn stooped and vomited into the grass, then set his empty hands in the sun as if testing that they were free. Eldra stood with a wooden cup, her face drained. The investigator catalogued each action because this was his work. Who had struck whom, which elder defended which house, what records survived intact. When the hush settled into a brittle quiet, the investigator took the chronicle and the remaining rune fragments to the runestone grove. He did not return to the hall. He needed a place where carved words could be read under an open sky. He set the papers in a hollow and wrote a precise account of the night's events in his journal, noting names and times. He wrapped the counter rune in oilcloth and buried it beneath a patch of lichen. He was careful about the final actions. He arranged for copies to be hidden in 3 separate places, and he instructed Sigrun on how to distribute them. Eldra would teach chosen clans the counter sequence quietly. They agreed, in brief sentences and practical motions, who would carry copies to the fisher houses and who would memorize the order. They planned in action rather than rhetoric. The investigator felt a cautious shift from despair to guarded hope. Yet as he sealed the journal with wax, he noticed the runestone's carved grooves shimmer with a faint, unreadable glow. It was a detail with no immediate function, but he stopped and pressed his palm to the cold stone. The glow did not vanish. He felt it at the base of his fingers, a prickling like static under the skin. He recorded this sensation in his notes, as plainly as he recorded who had blood and who had lied. The investigator left the grove quietly and walked back to the village lanes where some clans began to rebuild and others padded away with packs. Rongvold had withdrawn to lick wounds and marshal a force. The investigator's choices had ruptured the old system. Some clans would choose independence, some would tighten to the crown, and some would be arrested. He had not created a neat finish. He had forced a reckoning and placed evidence in multiple hands. Sigrun clasped one of the hidden copies and said, "Sigrun, we will teach the women." Her voice was low, deliberate. "Teach them to cut the wrist and read the lines. Teach them to bury the names if the king comes." The investigator watched her set her jaw. She did what the threat required. Eldra moved among the houses with the steadiness of a woman who had seen too many bargains. She carried the ash pot under a wool cloak and met the investigator with a look that had no relief, only calculation. The final day in the hall brought a last unambiguous event. A trader from the quarter whose name appeared on the marginal note arrived and presented 2 sealed boxes at the gate. The boxes contained receipts and a ledger proving shipments of bone and peat to the hall's quartering store. The evidence hardened the case and persuaded a number of elders to demand a formal tribunal. Roggenwald's defenders dwindled. Still, the investigator knew this was not an ending of perfect justice. Some men had been killed, some houses bore grief that no counter rune could undo, and Roggenwald retained a body of loyal men who would not surrender a crown without blood. The investigator recorded outcomes with blunt entries. Which elders declared independence, which clans accepted new rule, which prisoners were detained. He took responsibility for preserving the chronicle rather than pronouncing judgment. Before he left, he returned to the runestone grove and dug a shallow pit beneath a leaning stone. He placed in it the oilcloth, wrapped counter rune, a copy of the chronicle, and his own pencil sketches of the rune sequence. He tamped the soil and lay a flat stone atop the bundle. He marked the edges with lichen he had pried loose, and then blotted the last of his ink onto the journal's margin to seal the record. He paused, fingers in the dirt. A faint, unreadable glow lingered in the carved runes above him. He did not try to explain it. He wrote the observation into the journal with the same plainness as all his records. Runes retain a residual luminescence after countering. Unknown persistence. He closed the journal and placed it inside his satchel. He sealed his satchel's flap with a strip of leather and a knot he could untee with one hand. He left the runestone grove with steps measured and slow, carrying the journal and the knowledge that the oath's mechanism had been exposed and interrupted. Sigrun and Eldra would teach the counter rune. Bjorn would be free to choose. The investigator had shifted suspicion into action, doubt into revelation, and terror into a precarious agreement among houses. As he walked away, the last image fixed in his mind was the runestone's carved eye catching the dying light and holding a faint, persistent ember. He could not say whether the glow was a kernel of the oath's corruption or the stone S settling in the sea mist. He set his jaw and kept moving toward the marsh track, toward new inquiries, and toward the obligation of writing a true record. He buried copies, distributed knowledge, and closed a chapter by performing small, concrete acts. A burial, a handoff, a sealed note mailed to a distant alley. The investigator left the grove with the journal sealed in oilcloth. He walked into the late sun without a triumphant speech. The reckoning had been carried out in scratches on vellum, in blood, streaked palms, and in the practical, stubborn work of hiding truth where it could survive. He would return if the glow persisted, and he would follow any sign that the oath's corruption had taken another form. The chapter ends with him placing his oilcloth, wrapped journal into a shallow grave beneath lichen, and standing up as a clan child ran past with a piece of a burned bench. He closed his hands and began walking back toward the lanes, the weight of the journal a proof and a burden for what he had done.